So we're going to be talking about immigration, as you've seen. And I want to start with a little bit of context. There are about 45 million immigrants in the US, about half of whom are naturalized citizens. There are about 11 million undocumented immigrants. That's down slightly from the peak about 10 years ago at this point during the recession. And there have been approaching 2 million immigrants, just short of 2 million refugees resettled in the US over the past 25 years, and in the neighborhood of 600,000 folks granted asylum. Right now we have the lowest refugee admission ceiling that we've ever had in the modern refugee policy era from about 1980 onward. And we have calls for expediting asylum cases and rejecting more of those cases, rejecting more people. So we are on, let's say, uncertain ground right now. But what I want to talk about with that in mind is immigration policy as a distribution mechanism for rights and resources, particularly focusing on higher education, which is my field. And so there are many programs and services, as I'm sure we are aware, where eligibility is contingent on immigration status. In higher education, you have Pell Grants, in-state tuition rates in most states, state financial aid eligibility in virtually every state with a few exceptions, federal loans. Outside of higher education, you have things like, here in New York, eligibility for childcare subsidies are contingent on the child's immigration status. So immigration policy is used to distribute rights and resources that aren't directly immigration related. There are various facets of why I would argue that this might not be the best distribution mechanism. There is, we can get into that during the Q&A to the extent that we want to, but I think there are various ways that we will probably hear from other panelists that immigration policy has some issues with coherence, with design, with many areas, yeah, with everything. And that is an argument for amending immigration policy, of course, but in other contexts, I think it's worth looking at how the decision to use immigration policy as an eligibility mechanism takes that sort of incoherence and causes ripples out into education, for example, healthcare, housing, any venue where this is used to determine eligibility. So as an example, in New York State, to get back to the financial aid side of things, which is also part of my roots, undocumented students within New York State have eligibility to pay in-state tuition rates, but not access to state grants, and that's on top of the lack of access to federal grants, regardless of how long those students have lived in New York, have attended schools in New York. I believe that for US citizens, permanent residents, the residency standards is 12 months of continuous residence. I'm sure somebody in this room knows that specifically. I see at least one nod, thank you. So that's kind of the point of comparison. So my argument, I guess, is that immigration policy has a lot of incoherence to it, in addition to other descriptors that we could use, inhumanity perhaps, racism, but that with an incoherent policy being used as the basis for distributing a very wide range of rights and resources beyond sort of its immediate purview, it weakens policy in other venues. That education policy based on immigration policy carries over some of that incoherence. So my question for folks in the room is, keeping all of this in mind, to think about whether your policies, programs, and services are, any aspect of those are contingent on immigration status. If so, have you assessed who is being excluded by that eligibility criterion and sort of what the effects of that are? If that's not the case at your organization, that's great, thank you. But I would also encourage you to think about what other organizations, what other venues that your constituents, that your clients, that the people you serve are interacting with are using immigration status as a criterion, and do you have a way in your program design or delivery to help fill some of those gaps, to help bridge some of those services where folks may be getting left behind? I think, coming back to higher education, one example of this is partnerships like CUNY's partnership with the Dream.us scholarship fund to provide scholarships for folks who aren't eligible for federal financial aid. And then there are also various institutions using their own institutional funds to bridge some of those gaps. So as researchers, we want to look at the effects of that, but we also want to think within our own higher education context about ways that we can make changes to bridge gaps left by the use of immigration policy in non-immigration settings. Thanks.
Thanks, Tim. And thank you for the introduction. My academic training actually builds off my initial training with immigrant youth, which was I myself was a child of immigrants. My parents immigrated from Taiwan. And one of my first jobs outside of college was I was a middle school teacher working with a school that primarily served, and this is like the vocabulary of vulnerable. I choose the word marginalized because you're not born accidentally vulnerable. You're born in a society that marginalizes you. And realizing that in the school that I worked in, we tried really, really hard. And there were many things that I'm not sure that we did very well. And I think the most important thing was that none of us really had the time, not necessarily the capacity, we just didn't have the time to even think about what were we doing and the practices that we did that actually could be very harmful. So when you gave the challenge of make sure your policies aren't kind of accidentally exclusionary, right? That takes a lot of effort to actually be able to reflect on your own policies, right? And one of the reasons of going into academia, into a sociology program, into a demography program, was the idea that maybe researchers we actually have that time, that space, and that training to actually provide that oversight, to provide maybe the larger view. So I was told that, in our lightning round, right, we have time for 2 or 3 points, right? So my first point is for immigrant youth, and generally actually for marginalized youth, right, what is the role of schools, right? I think the vast majority of the research on immigrant youth is on academic indicators, who's graduating, who's reclassifying out of emergent bilingual status, all of these things, right? But to me, as a child of immigrants whose parents, their English developed over my English development, right? The most important thing that I learned from my suburb school in Maryland was actually how to be an American, right? Or how I was never really an American, right? And sociologists refer to this idea that schools are socializing institutions, right? It's not just about academics, it's not just about social mobility, but it's actually about finding your place in society. And you can imagine, right now I have a project through the generous funding of William T. Grant, working with immigrant high schoolers. And the idea that, this network of high schools, they serve high school students who literally have been in the country for less than 3 or 4 years, right? So these are 15-year-olds that have been in the US since they were 10, 11. And yes, they're really concerned about learning language and math and all of these things, but their number one concern is just how do I survive in a nice mental state in this new country that in many ways absolutely does not want me here. My second point is another core theory of sociology is that schools, I think in the education realm, sometimes we think of schools as wonderful, as great, they help youth. There's kind of a less cheery theory that schools actually just reproduce existing stratification, right? So one of the reasons why we argue, why is it that the youth in the past that were marginalized are still the youth that are marginalized and likely will be the youth that will be marginalized in the future? It's actually because of schools, right? That the structure of schooling reproduces these inequalities. And my work extends it not just to this academic stratification, right? So those who don't do well in math and don't go into STEM, but the idea that, 100 years ago, right, as the United States opened its, through policy, opened its doors, I guess, to immigration, right, that groups of people came in and certain groups didn't feel like they really had claim to this country. And those groups are the same groups that 50 years forward are the same groups that feel like they have no claim to this country, right? And I believe in the future will be the same groups that are told that we have no claim to this country, right? And how do we get that notion? I think it starts with schools, right? As simple as a teacher saying, you really need to speak English in this class, right? One phrase that devalues essentially everything about identity. And my third point is what beyond immigration status and nativity, what are characteristics that shape these patterns? And I think oftentimes when I review papers, when I talk to and NGOs, it's all about immigration, and there's no mention of race, right? And to me, as someone who's trained in the idea that race, ethnicity, and immigration are actually, they cannot be separated, right? That the three of them define each other, right? And that immigration has changed our understanding of race, right? I encourage, in my own work, I encourage people who are concerned about immigration, particularly immigrant youth, right? That it's not just, oh, they're foreign born, right? Oh, it's just that we have to help them in the United States, right? But the idea that their race matters so much, right? And that to equate, for instance, the experience of a Chinese immigrant youth to a Haitian immigrant youth to a Mexican immigration youth and just say, oh, you're all immigrants, like that is, I think, profoundly not their experience, and something that could be very dangerous. Thanks.
So my name is Sabrina. I'm a policy and research advisor at the Mayor's Office of Immigrant Affairs. And I just want to briefly, in my remarks, kind of talk about the role of our office, what our goals are, and kind of implicit in that, the role of what local government can do to really support immigrant youth, particularly in an increasingly hostile federal environment. So the Mayor's Office of Immigrant Affairs is an office within the Mayor's Office that's our mission is to support programs and policies on behalf of immigrant New Yorkers. And Tim gave some great stats about what the immigrant demographic population is for the country. But in New York City, we're a city of nearly 40% foreign born. That number goes up to be about 60% when you consider children of immigrants. There's about 500,000 undocumented New Yorkers in New York City. The majority, about 62% of New Yorkers, live in a household with at least one immigrant. And that includes over 1 million New Yorkers who live in a mixed status household, meaning there's at least one undocumented person in their household. So I think very much when MOIA, which is the acronym for the Mayor's Office of Immigrant Affairs, approaches policy, we look at it, yes, from a population perspective of immigrants and immigrant youth, but also holistically from the whole family. And we think through policies and programs that could really service the entire family as a way of building trust with our communities. And so the first goal of our office is truly just to embed immigrant inclusion across all of city government and city life. So that's working with all of our agency partners, including some here today, like Department of Education, ACS, DYCD, Department of Health, to work through their policies to be more inclusive. And that could look anything from language access policies, making sure that things are being delivered appropriately in language or there's interpretation available, things are translated where needed, but also we also help launch programs like the IDNYC program, which is the largest municipal ID program in the country and has been largely successful. And it essentially grants government-issued photo identification for anyone 14 years and up, for a photo ID regardless of immigration status. And now we're actually undergoing the rules process to see if we can lower the age to about 10 years old for those to get an IDNYC, because we're thinking that at 10 you're in middle school, you're very much on your own, and you may encounter police, you may be in situations where you need to have photo identification. So if you have thoughts about that, join our public hearing in June. But I think that's an example of how we're continually both thinking through the needs and using the data. We did a program evaluation to highlight where our gaps in service are, where we're doing well. That's where we're finding that about a third of our youth survey respondents got the ID because it's their only form of ID. And so if we have a better understanding of what's motivating people to seek services and perhaps why they trust certain city institutions, it helps us do our work to tailor our outreach, to tailor our programming. Our next goal is also to increase access to justice, and is largely through immigration legal services and making that more accessible to every New Yorker who needs it. And that's both as a poverty-fighting strategy as well as an equity strategy. And our flagship program that we launched is called Action NYC, which provides immigration legal services through community-based organizations. But we've also placed it in community schools, in international high schools, and essentially bringing immigration legal services, so an immigration attorney, to places where immigrants already are and delivering it to them in the languages that they need. And you'll be surprised that it's these operational barriers that are truly what's in the way of building trust within these communities, and then just getting them to come forward and to seek services. And perhaps the last thing I'll mention is that we also, as a mayor's office, are using our platform as a coordinating body and also to do advocacy on the federal level, we founded a coalition called Cities for Action, which is a coalition of about over 100 cities and their Mayor's Office of Immigrant Affairs. And we work together to share best practices, research ideas, research that we find, and then also, coordinate together to file amicus briefs, open letters to the presidential administration, among other things. And I have 15 seconds, so perhaps I'll save the rest for any questions or answers.
Hi, everyone. Thanks to my panelists. Very interesting to hear about everything everyone's working on. My name's Liz Markuci. I'm the director of the Immigration Project at Volunteers of Legal Service. Our nonprofit was founded over 35 years ago during the Reagan cuts. And at the time, they were threatening the and cutting legal services access and funding. And so leaders of the city bar got together and created an organization that would try to tap into the resources and skills of major law firms in the city and sort of build capacity for providing legal services to New Yorkers in need, and also to galvanize the bar to sort of give back to the community and sort of create pro bono as sort of an ethical obligation and be a vanguard, galvanize the bar to volunteer in this way. And over the years, they've been involved in a variety of different projects. You can check out our website because I don't have a lot of time to cover a lot of things today. But my particular project started where they had started partnerships with law firms providing civil legal clinics about 15 years ago in a select group of 6 New York City high school to address a myriad of civil legal issues that impact a child's education. So they could handle housing conditions where, kids who can't take warm showers are not going to be functioning well, or they don't have heat, or different other issues, access to public benefits. And immigration kept coming up, and that's where I was brought on, initially part-time as a consultant. I was also working at for CUNY Citizenship Now at the time and meeting young people at CUNY colleges who actually could have benefited from legal assistance had they been assessed earlier. There were remedies. I was seeing about 20% of individuals who could have had a pathway to citizenship, but just never had access to justice, never had access to legal resources. And in 2011, when the government failed to pass the DREAM Act another time, and I read the story of a young person who was so demoralized by the lack of government support that he took his own life. And I saw a need to launch a program. At the time, it was very ambitiously called A Dream Not Deferred, from the Langston Hughes poem. We've now made it just the Immigration Project because it's a lot easier for everyone to remember. And what we're doing now is really evolved over time in response to the needs of the young people that we are talking to. It's a very holistic program, so it's not really efficient. But I think it's addressed issues in ways that I think some of the models in the city do not really look at a young person's needs. So we've done Know Your Rights workshops. We recruit and train the lawyers to go out into the communities. So we were, actually, I did advise. I was called into the mayor's office to advise when they were launching the project. I'm like, great, more people doing this work, and in a different way. But we also do direct representation. We get the firms to help us with some policy research. So we're sort of informally doing these partnerships. We do community education. And more recently, we've been trying to expand from direct legal services into other types of assistance. Like some of the young people we work with want to become entrepreneurs, and we want to connect them with the resources to do that. And really correct a lot of the misinformation. I've seen teachers who have denied young people who have asylum and are considered a qualified alien eligible for FAFSA funding, and sort of we do trainings for the staff about immigration law and the things that they don't know. Right now we're seeing a huge increase in fear, the erosion of protections. I've never had a more challenging year as an immigration lawyer. The stress levels, both of the clients that we serve, the communities we were talking to, the other people who serve, like the staff of the schools, and even other practitioners. There's a huge bump in stress and trauma from doing this work and what's been happening in terms of the relentless attacks. So we've been really trying to think, how can we change the narrative and the dialogue? How can we amplify the voices of our clients and not have them portrayed as vulnerable? I was really happy you mentioned that. They're powerful and they're tenacious and they've gone, they just lack access to opportunity, and the system is rigged against them. What people don't realize is that the history of immigration law is intended to keep people out, and it's intended to keep certain people out. And the history is very racist. I can link you to a chart of, like, from the Chinese exclusion laws to so many different ways that you can examine those things. So I'm happy to answer questions about the increasing criminalization of immigrants and the impact that's had on our clients as well.
For the audience, we have the 5 minute. This is so helpful. It's amazing. Yes. I know it's and I also have my cell phone here to keep time. Although now I have this. So my first question, Liz, builds off the point of it is very easy to kind of only focus on barriers, only focus on needs, and all of us, when we spoke about the work that we do, we actually largely framed it as there were elements of there's so many strengths that immigrant youth, families, communities have, particularly in New York City. And I think it's not just an exercise, but it's actually really important, right? So I'm very curious, what are your thoughts on the strengths of immigrant students, immigrant families, and also immigrant enclaves, immigrant communities?
I'll just keep this handy, unless someone else wants to say. I mean, one of the things, I'm so glad you asked the question because I ran out of time and I wanted to talk about this, but so we've spent the last 2 years working with a group of volunteers to create a documentary where the young people are telling their own stories about their own trajectory, and we want to continue to do that so that they can share their strengths themselves and be proud of that and sort of be encouraged to embrace who they are and project that to the world about sort of their hopes for the future, all the things that they've accomplished, and really change that narrative that that you're hearing over and over again. And I think that's been a really important part of the work that we're doing, where we're partnering with them, that we are, they have agency and we work with them, not for them. Does that make sense? And so just sort of shifting a little bit, but I mean, I could spend the whole day talking about how amazing all of them are and how rich my life has been with the opportunity to work with them. And I tell them that all the time. And it's really just sort of being really mindful of how you're having those conversations and projecting that and sharing those stories.
I also wanted to add, our office has been increasingly using data, and I think data modeling to kind of highlight the impacts of, or at least the contributions of immigrants, including young people. For example, DACA recipients. There's about 30,000 DACA recipients in New York City, and there have been plenty of studies kind of documenting the pre and post economic benefits of DACA upon these people. They go to higher education, they go on to have work authorization. But I think the role of our office sometimes to help either that work or help providers deliver services to these populations is also to highlight we would like to put together data profiles and model their contribution to the city's gross domestic product, right, to the GDP, to highlight that even though they're young people, they work across all of these industries. They're deeply embedded in our city's life, right? I think the majority have been here, for 15 years or more of their life. So I think data has also played a huge role in our advocacy work, both to kind of use data to paint a more humanizing picture that doesn't just focus on, their constraints, but also what they contribute to our city every day. But then also model that should a DREAM Act pass, that there's about 150,000 New Yorkers that could potentially benefit from this. So these are not small numbers, I think. And just to highlight the theme of this conference, we also like to, use a lot of data and research more to kind of bolster our work.
There has been so much of the movement in the conversation around immigration policy, immigration rights, that has been pushed forward and driven and shaped by immigrant youth. I don't know if it's particularly in education, but definitely within education as well. A few years ago when there was, maybe the last time there was a serious conversation about the potential of large-scale immigration reform, you would see a lot of news profiles on TV, magazines, whatever, of here is this undocumented high schooler who is valedictorian, 4.5 GPA, captain of 3 teams, and the homecoming king, queen, prom, whatever it is. And I think there were immigrant youth-led advocacy didn't start in that moment, but I think did an incredible job of shifting and shaping the conversation to say, no, we don't deserve access to education because of my GPA. I deserve access to education as a human right. I deserve access to other resources as because of my humanity, not because I happen to have this GPA. B+ students get to have an education too. C students have rights as well. And I think on campuses and in the national conversation, immigrant youth have done a really incredible job of leading that conversation, of pushing other advocates to be where they need to be, and to broadening the conversation beyond that sort of narrow view to include families, to include parents, to push back against the narrative of, oh, don't blame these students. They didn't make the decision to. No, students and their parents, young people, and their families have a right to basic human decency and more.
And I mean, I'm definitely not a philosopher, so human decency, I use it in a very colloquial term, but I feel like there's this idea of, I want to broaden this more than New Yorker or American, but like the ideal human being is someone who is open-minded, who is loving, who cares about each other. And like empirically, some of my words, immigrant youth are the most likely to be civically minded, civically participate, who say that it's super important to help their communities, all of these things. And I mean, even when I would say a lot of my work is with undocumented Chinese individuals in New York City and having real conversations about anti-Blackness, for instance, it starts off really not so great sometimes, right? It sounds really not that great, but very easily in a couple steps, right? It's easy for me to say, okay, you can easily find sympathy and similarities, and suddenly there is a movement, right? And the comparison of talking to the highly educated, right? The nice liberals, right? Where they know all the answers, but then I'm like, I'm actually not quite sure that I've moved your mind in any way. And I mean, Tim, I really like your point about it's not just about your production, right? It's not just, immigrants are only we should love immigrants because they're so plucky and wonderful, and they get the job done, right? That immigrants are just, like all of us are human beings, right? And that to put the expectation that in order for us to care about you, you have to be extraordinary is actually dehumanizing in its sense, right?
And I mean, there's a real movement in increasingly, in order to win any kind of immigration legal relief, you had to be more and more vulnerable. Right? It's like, you know what I mean? Like you always have to top the set. And I think there's been this sort of desensitization, like it's even with the photos, like how horrible does the photo need to be for people to respond to a tragedy? And so in terms of like winning an asylum case, like I think there's a real danger in saying, oh, well, like you have to be, either the most deserving, the deserving poor, the deserving immigrant, or the most vulnerable. And, one of the young people in the documentary I mentioned said, it's okay to have come here for a better life. And just to articulate, this sort of concept that we've had in this country for a really, really long time, that you know what I mean? You either have to be the most vulnerable or the most, like the highest achiever, and everybody else in the middle is worthless or a criminal.
And this brings me to the second discussion point, which is I don't want to there's an assumption, definitely on the panel, I would say within this audience, that we all agree that immigrants are deserving of some sort of human rights, right? And very unfortunately, that seems like not the temperature of the large chunk of the United States, right? And I'm not even saying the caricature of the extremes, right? But even just like, I would say many, many New Yorkers will say, oh, of course I'm for immigrant rights, but absolutely at no sacrifice to me, right? Like, I love them unless they're in my school, right? I love them unless they mess with my child's English ability, right? So then how do we convince those, like how do we convince them, right? That we have the assumption here that, oh, we must support immigrant youth, right? I think that's actually a very false assumption, particularly in the research realm, right? And that policy nowadays, I mean, our own Secretary of Education recommending that we violate federal law and encouraging people, educators to actually say, to participate in the deportation process, right? Like that is what our officials are saying. So how do we convince them, right? How do we convince them to actually care? This is an impossible question, but I'm super curious.
I think sometimes, I mean, it is an impossible question, and I agree that there's probably this assumption that we don't have to make that basis or that claim. It's a human right. But I think in kind of talking to the larger country, and like this pertains to our work when we do, you know, advocacy on a national level around DACA or the DREAM Act or, you know, TPS, whatever it is, it's sometimes crude, but we kind of have to focus on, you know, the economic contributions of these populations, but also demonstrating that, you know, these policies are harmful, right? Not just to the impacted populations, but to the society at large, right? There's like in terms of what research is needed, and I think is already out there, but I think more can always be done, is to show and demonstrate that cities or places where there are welcoming policies, right, where confidentiality is protected, are safer cities, right? Like there's a reason that New York City is the safest big city. And so I think, I don't know if it's the most effective tool, but I think one route that we're approaching it is in order to speak to the larger country, is to show that immigrant friendly policies are just good policies. They make us safer, they're better for our economy, etc.
It's also not a zero-sum game.
Right.
And I think you touch on, like, as long as there's no cost to me. And I think it's about unraveling that notion that that your economic challenges are that the immigrants are responsible for that. That's not a new story. That's happened with different politicians and waves of immigrants, and really tying it into what you mentioned earlier, that it is connected to race and racism, and in what immigration policies have allowed and intended to be written to allow certain groups of people from certain parts of the world access to entry into this country and exclude others. And so a long time ago, when you had immigration laws that changed to favor family-based migration, the thought was this is going to allow people from white European countries to come in. And the result was that's not actually how it happened. And now, all of a sudden, chain migration, and I don't even like to repeat that kind of language, but an underlying policy of immigration law was family unity, and that's being dismantled now in order to address the fact that their concept of how they were going to keep America white, let's just be really real about like what we're talking about here and just name it, didn't pan out. And all of a sudden now you want to eliminate those opportunities for people to bring family members, because it's bringing in people from the undesirable countries based on the people in power that do not want to address all of these issues that we're talking about.
Going back to touch on Sebastian's point about value, how often we express the value of immigration in terms of productivity, that is something that we do want to avoid. But I also think that the nation is demonstrably better because of immigration, that immigration demonstrably makes this a better place, both in sort of a values way and in a more cold-hearted, number crunchy way. And I think there is a place and a value in demonstrating that vocally and often, without letting that be the start or the end of the conversation of why we value immigrants, how we view immigrants. I think there's part of this is finding the place for that, where that's not the defining characteristic of immigration that we're talking about, but where that message is still getting out to people with whom it'll resonate.
Thank you for your thoughts. And I mean, I always say that, not that there's like a trickle-down activism, but that you can address like anti-xenophobia and all these things, but to me, it is still a question about race, right? And that addressing and when I mean race, I mean premised on anti-blackness in the United States. That how can you imagine that if you actually or if you talk to people about essentially what is happening, what has happened and still is happening and probably will still happen between the treatment of Black Americans and the white hegemon in the U.S., that if we try to address that we will suddenly, like the idea of deportations, right? The idea of ripping apart, I mean, all of those like horrible images in the media, that those things will also be addressed. Because it brings us to some semblance of like a, I don't know, to borrow Niobe Wei's idea, the common humanity, right? To end on a perhaps less like, I think we went there. I always bring it right there, right?
We have to go there.
Yeah, we have to go there. And this is actually something that whenever I talk to any non-academic, my first question always is, how can I serve, right? How can I help, and how do I hinder, right? And I know that even this question is a burden, right? I always, whenever I have students who say, I want to work with nonprofits, I want to work with one of the organizations you work with, can I email them and ask them what I can do? I'm like, that is a burden, because they're probably, as a nonprofit, really, really like taxed for time, and then an additional email from some random person saying, how can I help, is not so great, right? But we are in this convenient panel with a wonderful audience, and I guess the question would be, how can researchers, how can the mayor's office of immigration, how can legal nonprofits, and nonprofits in general, how can we help each other? Or what do we need from each other? I guess I'll start with this one, right? You're like, oh God, I need you to stop talking, Sebastian. No. So from government officials, from the mayor's office, and the government is writ large very, very amorphous. I've worked with family courts, and I'm terrified when I walk into those rooms, right? Because literally my goal is to convince judges actually that like it shouldn't be essentially an oppression Olympics, right? That, oh, be more, it shouldn't be, they have to tell these horrible stories in order for them to get asylum status, right? But then I imagine that working with the mayor's office, and I've never actually worked with your office before, but that the alignment that when Adam was talking, the idea that we are aligned in many, many ways, right? And in some ways, when I've worked with nonprofits before, oftentimes they see me as like the numbers guy, the data person, right? And sometimes I will literally just say, if you have a numbers question, feel free to email me, and I can, if I can, I will try to give you a response. And there are times where I give a response and they're like, okay, so your answer has opened up 20 other questions. Can you please go back to the original? And there are times where they're like, we actually hired people in the past to do what you did in 5 minutes. Right? Not that I'm so awesome. I think it's just what I do every single day, right? And in some ways, our research needs access, and this is actually probably like the most tangible in some ways, right? It is oftentimes very difficult for researchers to partner with organizations under the realm of research, because I think research oftentimes is seen as intrusive, and sometimes rightfully so. So I guess from the research realm, I would say perhaps more collaboration, more openness, and more access. What would the mayor's office need from the rest of us?
And maybe I should be clear, I'm kind of the numbers person too. I am, at least in my office, I am not an immigration attorney, but I will, and so I'm also the person they come to when it's like, we're designing a program. Can you help us tailor how do we reach immigrants so that we make sure that the people that we're serving include everyone in that community, right? It's not just US born, because when you look at the demographic data of like who has health insurance versus who is not, the disparity is really jarring, right? Like you're talking 94% of US born New Yorkers have health insurance versus 69% of non-citizens. And then that only persists when you look at children or undocumented children. So it's kind of, so that's my role. But I think what is needed in terms of the research field is like building out the more and perhaps it's quantitative, like the more qualitative look at it's always hard to keep up a policy timeline and a research timeline, right? Policy often happens urgently, and we have to respond. It's rapid response. But research, it's like we need 2 years worth of administrative data. We need, to establish rigor. And I think there's always, I think it's always valuable to have researchers help us, because we know what we want to be able to say and what we want to be able to prove. I think it helps to have researchers help us actually scope that out as a research question, how to get it done. And then I'm also aware that there's plenty of research that has been done that can help answer or say what we want to say. But there's always not a very clean or neat clearinghouse of that research. And I think research just is always just good generally for us office, because it shows that our policies and our programs are evidence informed, they're strategic. We can initiate innovative research, we can work with community organizations to address emerging needs. So I think that's always a need from the research community.
We work in, probably all of our contexts work in silos too much of the time. That's a little bit of a facile point, but launching into whatever research project, I'm working on things that I have no idea how many people within a 10-mile radius of me are also working on closely linked things. And this is true with research, this is true with advocacy work, this is true with service delivery, program delivery, policy. I think that's a need. I don't know what the solution is other than the dating app for research and practice and policy. My name's Tim, and I like hiking, and I'm working on these areas. If you have ideas, let's talk. But I think that the more that we can go into conversations in settings like this, not just with curiosity, but with an idea of who in this room can I work with, who in this room can I help or get help from, and how can I do that in both short-term, immediate ways and longer-term, more involved ways. I think there's room for both and value in both.
See, I have either very specific research needs, like that I came today hoping that I would find people and inspiration and connections that address a lot of the anecdotal stories or observations that I'm making in the population that I serve, because ultimately I need funding to be able to expand the work that I'm doing. And I think that the current funding models devalue expertise in immigration, and I don't think the system is so rigged that I don't often think that untrained volunteers can effectively assist someone navigating the asylum process in the current landscape. And a lot of the funding models are currently funding people that are fresh out of law school or not even trained at all, and people that have been doing the work. There's a tipping point for how many people actually have been doing the work for 10 or 20 years, and there's no way to support that knowledge and sort of disseminating that. So there's that piece of it. I'd love to work with someone to sort of think through sustaining people with expertise in the field. You have a lot of burnout. A lot of different lawyers that do immigration work, we were talking about this earlier, are going through vicarious trauma in doing this work, and that's not something that's really been addressed by lawyers. We're starting to think about doing that, and through the coalitions that we're involved in. So that's certainly interesting. You mentioned earlier the partnership between that scholarship and CUNY, but I know that there are clients that I have that have dropped out because when they got DACA, they're now the only person in their family that has authorization to work, and there's like a family of 5 and their parents are undocumented, and so wanted to go to college and they can't, and when they're in a position to go back, those scholarships aren't available to them because you have to be going right from high school. So I think the conversations you're talking about in terms of the siloing, about the research and the people that are making policy, that it's informed by people that are having conversations either with the youth themselves, but also have been observing this for a long time and see those patterns.